Hello everyone, this is StrawberryShorty here with my review of The Evil Within. Not really sure what images or video will be accompanying this review. I was able to use the trailers for the Resident Evil Infinite Darkness one, but this review ended up a lot longer than I intended. I had looked the game up a while ago, but never really felt compelled to play it for some reason. Ended up getting motivated to do so after seeing this top 10 video by, I think it was Outside Xbox, and they were featuring bosses that were having way more fun than you are. Thought the guy on the thumbnail looked kind of interesting, so I checked the video to see who he was, and learned that he was from one of the Evil Within games. I ended up getting very interested in the character, who I learned is from the second game, and it's like, well, I kind of want to play them now. So I ended up nabbing them for PS4 during the 4th of July sale. I'll probably review the second one eventually, probably sooner rather than later. So I'm not going in here completely blind. I know some of the plot details that are going on, but nothing about the gameplay. Also, feel I should mention that the left joystick on my current controller kind of acts up from time to time, which may have made some segments more difficult than they might have otherwise been. And you can thank Resident Evil Village and the Resident Evil 2 remake for that. Pushing the joystick in and holding it to run is annoying and damages the controller. I'm ordering a new one, and together with a decent tripod, which will hopefully be here tomorrow, the controller came already and seems to work fine. I'm gonna start off by talking a bit about the game's basic plot and gameplay style, giving as much of an opinion as I can before moving on to some more spoilery talking points. There will be a warning before we start discussing any spoilers. So, let's get started. I want to start off by saying that upon booting up the game, I had it freeze on a black screen before crashing with this error code. I did a Google search and found out a lot of people had experienced this, even like years ago. It happened several times during gameplay too, and while it's not really a game-breaking issue, it is frustrating that was never patched even after all this time. So, there's not much to say about the game's basic setup, which I actually knew really nothing about. You play as Detective Sebastian Castellanos, who, together with his partner Joseph Oda and rookie Julie Kidman, has been called to investigate some kind of disturbance at Beacon Mental Hospital. I feel like saying much more than that would cross into spoiler territory, but some really surreal things end up happening, and you and your colleagues find yourself trapped in what seems to be almost like an alternate dimension, together with Officer Connolly, Dr. Jimenez from the hospital, and his patient Leslie. You get separated from the others, finding yourself alone in a bizarre world filled with deadly traps and horrifying monsters. While you can fight in this game, alternating between a variety of weapons that have different advantages, ammo can be scarce and you're encouraged early on to be stealthy, relying on throwing bottles to distract enemies, hiding, and sneaking up behind your foes to stab them in the head. Fallen enemies might not stay dead, however, unless you use matches to set them ablaze. Matches, much like ammo, aren't limitless, often forcing you to choose which enemies to permanently dispose of. I'm not new to stealth horror games. The stealth mechanics of this game are actually pretty similar to a newer one I've played, called Remothered Tormented Fathers. Still, I died repeatedly during the encounter where this mechanic was introduced. Using bottles to create a distraction was not part of the in-game tutorial. I feel we should have been told about that the minute we picked one up. Instead, I was lucky enough to spot it among the random tips that appeared during the loading screens. Hiding rarely feels worth doing, especially as the game progresses. You'll often have trouble seeing your enemies from wherever you hide, which makes it kind of difficult to tell when it's safe to come out. Speaking of that first encounter, it was incredibly frustrating, and unfortunately that's how I often felt throughout the game. Frustrated. The game thankfully utilizes checkpoints that you can reload from if you die, but it's very easy to get yourself killed, and having to redo a bunch of stuff is really infuriating. There's a stamina bar, so you can't run fast very long starting out, and your melee attacks are basically useless. Not wanting to use much ammo, the most you can do is try to stay hidden and take out enemies via sneak kills, but if you get spotted, you have to run around to try and lose them, while hopefully not gaining the attention of another enemy. And if you're not careful, you might end up running straight into a trap, and those will often kill you instantly. There are sometimes other weapons lying around that you can make use of one time each, torches that set your enemies on fire, and axes that instantly kill them. These are useful, but another mechanic never properly explained. I wasted a match trying to use the torch to burn a fallen enemy, thinking that was what we were supposed to do with it. I ended up having to look at online strategy guides more than once, most commonly for the bosses. There were some that you just wouldn't know what to do with them, like bosses that you couldn't or shouldn't try to kill directly. Then it feels like the gameplay just switches up on you. The early chapters really push the stealth aspect. Then, suddenly, it feels like you're being encouraged to take on enemies directly. You're repeatedly put in situations where you have to engage in combat, and hiding is just not even really an option. Then stealth suddenly becomes a thing again, only for them to introduce an enemy you can't sneak kill, which they don't tell you about. You'll only realize you can't when you try, which quite possibly will lead to you being killed and having to start the section over. That's another part of what adds to the frustration feature. You'll get thrown into a situation or encounter where there's just something you don't know how to properly deal with, and that will cause you to die. There's one enemy that's suddenly introduced that can insta-kill you. Some guides say you can sneak kill them, but I died several times trying, and looking into it, many players encountered the same issue, where sometimes they could, but other times they couldn't. They can be dealt with easily enough if you know what you have to do, but without looking at a guide, you're likely to waste a lot of ammo and die a bunch of times. This leads me to another issue I had with a mechanic sometimes not working. Traps are littered throughout the game and can be dismantled for parts, which you can then use to make different bolts for your crossbow. Some just require you to hold the X button, while others force you to play a timing game where you need to stop a needle in a certain area. If you fail the latter, you will take a lot of damage. You can sneak past these traps, but if you need to come back to that area or an enemy attack forces you to stand, you risk getting blown up. Some of the enemies wield crossbows of their own later in the game, which they use to shoot rounds that blow up after a time. Sometimes, around these enemies, you'll find areas littered with these rounds. Sometimes I could sneak up and disarm them for parts, but other times attempting to do so would activate them, and I would get blown up and, die. I should probably mention this now, a bit late into the review to do so, but there's this safe area you'll often return to where you can save your game, use small keys you find to gain resources, and upgrade your abilities, weapons, and inventory. I mostly upgraded my inventory because it can be really irritating to have to leave behind what few bits of ammo and matches and stuff you find. All in all, the gameplay's pacing kind of felt really off. I'd also kind of say the same about the story. We don't get enough time with any of the characters, making it hard to really feel much when things happen involving most of them. There's a bunch of files and audio tapes you can find, but it felt like those became scarcer as the game went on. The safe area I talked about has these newspaper articles and missing posters, but most of them feel like they don't really add anything to the game. It feels like there's a lot about this game that doesn't make sense or is simply never addressed. I know the DLC and sequel address a few of these points, but no one playing the game when it first came out would. And there are still plenty of loose ends I know that they don't address, which is frustrating. Right now there's nothing concrete about an Evil Within 3 either. At this point, I think we'll shift into talking about spoilers, so if you haven't played the game yet, you might want to stop watching until you have. To make things easier, I plan to go chapter to chapter. I probably won't do this typically, but since I just beat the game, there's a lot of specific stuff I want to say about some of those chapters. So sorry if this goes on a bit. Okay, so in the first chapter, I died so many times, and it was really beginning to get on my nerves. After everything goes all Silent Hill on us, I just could not see those freaking keys, so I kept getting killed by the chainsaw guy. Then I died a bunch of times when you have to sneak past him in the hospital. The fact that your character is injured and not walking properly during this part made it a real pain, because if he saw you, you were basically screwed. Chapters 2 started off pretty wild with the city being destroyed. I already knew we were in a sort of simulation, but wasn't expecting anything like that. Officer Connolly showed off some pretty epic driving, and it's a bummer he got killed off pretty much immediately. I kind of hoped he'd make it through, despite us seeing him turn, since none of this is real exactly, but no such luck. Leslie seems like a good kid, though he's actually apparently in his 20s. He was the one character where I had no idea what his ultimate fate would be, and I kept rooting for him to survive. This chapter was the first one where I got myself blown up. I ran right into a tripwire after finally managing to kill those two guys, the first non-Officer Connolly enemies you face, which was really annoying. Then I triggered that mob coming after me, but failed to realize this was unavoidable, so I restarted from my autosave. Chapter 3 was deeply unsettling because I kept hearing that horrible growling and could not tell where the heck it was coming from. Eventually entered the barn and saw the chainsaw guy chained up. Clearing the village of all the bad guys was a bit of a chore, and there was a lot of running back to the save room so I wouldn't lose progress. Thankfully, I glanced at a guide because I completely missed collecting the crossbow and the frostbolt. The fight with the chainsaw guy was terrifying, even with the whole village to run around in. I ended up mostly fighting him in the barn and the area outside it, just climbing up the ladder, running around to the other side and just hitting him with explosion bolts and shotgun blasts. Looking back on Chapter 4, I feel like we spent more time with Dr. Jimenez than any other character in this game. His brother is apparently one of the people here, but I still have no idea how he got into this world. Jimenez didn't say anything about him being missing, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing, is it Jimenez or Jimenez? I'm gonna keep saying Jimenez. I already forgot how it's pronounced. Oh, and there goes Leslie again. We follow him, and we fight this invisible enemy. And I had to look up what to do here because I could hear something but had no idea what it was. I feel like this enemy type was a terrible idea, and while it seems strange, I'm glad we only really see them again in one other chapter. The first encounter with Laura was pretty scary. I'd known of her existence, but seeing her in action was something else. I could smell a trap in that bloody corpse from a mile away, but there was nowhere else to go, and I wanted to get that gel that was behind it. I died the first time, mainly because I had no idea you weren't supposed to try and fight her. Chapter 5, we finally get to see Joseph and Kidman again. This is where the game starts to force us more directly into combat instead of stealth. The whole fight where you're trying to save Kidman was a real pain, and I got blown up about 10 times. We get another boss fight against Laura, and I feel like I only won this because I accidentally activated the incinerator. We reunite with Joseph again in Chapter 6, and I kind of like him, even if we don't get to see much of him. By the time he broke that ladder climbing up it, I was thinking to myself, he has to have become some kind of meme. Like, he runs across the bridge and it breaks, he loses glasses in a boss area, and then that goes and happens. It's just like, seems like he destroys everything he comes into contact with. So we fight two big monsters, who I guess were supposed to be the twins mentioned in those files that we found, but the game never really made that clear. Chapter 7 is the area where they bring back stealth, only to suddenly introduce an enemy type we can't sneak kill. It's also where we first properly encounter the Keeper. I'd seen images of him before, but was wondering how scary a guy with a safe for a head could really be. He's actually pretty terrifying. You can't keep him down, and you have to avoid his traps while trying to find a way out. Chapter 8 started, and then ended about 5 seconds later with nothing really happening. Nice to see a mansion location for Chapter 9, and we end up having to deal with Ruvik, the game's antagonist, a bit more directly. I think he's a pretty interesting looking character, and though we weren't told what to do when he shows up, knowing he could appear at any time really made things more tense. He ended up not showing up a lot for me, though. That might be for the best, since I was always running back to the save room out of worry I'd suddenly get owned by him. Those brain puzzles were really confusing, and I ended up just looking up the answers. Still had trouble with the last one, though. Had to, watch a video for that. The safe painting jump scare was probably one of the scariest moments in the game for me. I absolutely hated the maze in this chapter, mostly because the locks on some of the gates were really hard to see, and you'd die instantly if Ruvik touched you. It was nice to learn a bit more about Ruvik, and it's pretty terrible what happened to his sister, and to him. I knew who Ruvik was vaguely going into this. I knew that we were in his head, and he was dangerous. I'd kind of been under the impression he had lived centuries ago, which would have explained all the villages and the peasants and the old-looking areas. His family dresses like they're from a long time ago, too, and the whole thing about land disputes felt more like something from the past. Learning that Ruvik was actually alive in more modern times, I'm kind of confused as to why so much seems to suggest otherwise. It feels like maybe he was initially intended to be from centuries ago, but maybe it got changed late in development. Haven't heard anything about that, though. Chapter 10, for me, is the worst chapter in this game. It's insanely long and filled with some cheap deaths that force you to redo so much stuff. There are traps, a sniper, some spinning blade carousel thing that can chop your head off. Not to mention a bunch of enemies, some of which have guns. I kept swinging my torch at this one enemy, and it took forever to hit her for some reason. After finally surviving this part, ended up in some nightmare factory where a bunch of traps suddenly get activated. You also get to deal with a lot more enemies, including these huge guys who do a lot of damage and don't die easy. I turned to a guide more than once because the autosave is at the beginning of this trap segment, and there are a lot of moments where you can die because you didn't expect something. Feels a bit like cheating, but I had already died so much this chapter, I just wanted it to be over. I thought it would be after getting to the door we went through all that to open, but then they throw Laura at us again. She can kill you instantly, and you trying to get her with the fire traps involves shooting levers and hoping you do it at the right time. It can be kind of hard to see her while doing this. And there's a high chance she'll kill you if you fail. I decided to kill her for the gel, but thanks to IGN's guide, I kept trying in the wrong room, and they kept telling me to burn the bodies before she could use them, even though you can use them to damage her a lot if you time it right. I died so much, and then I finally seemed to beat her, but there was no gel, she just vanished. Turns out you have to get her in the next room. I died about 1,000,000 more times, walked into a few fire traps, but finally managed to get her, burn her with everything I could. It was tense and infuriating, and she kept teleporting and crawling really fast, and I kept accidentally walking into those traps and dying to her. I finally beat her, but ended up really short on ammo for the rest of the game. I'd even used up most of my parts, despite having disarmed every trap up until that point and barely crafting any bolts. Kinda made me regret battling her. You might not want to try it unless you're like on a lower difficulty or you really want that achievement. So after that, we get a cutscene of poor Leslie getting hurt, and I really just want this kid to live. Oh, and Jimenez dies. Don't know what else to say about that. The chapter is still going, and I am terrified at this point because it's just like I just like wanted like a checkpoint, and I just remember being in that freaking eternal elevator ride and just so worried the game would crash after I finally beat Laura. And then they go and they throw me into another boss fight, and this boss was a nightmare. On top of me being so short on ammo after Laura, this boss gains a one-hit kill ability, and it is not slow. I finally managed to beat it, and then I went to sleep, and I literally had a nightmare where I was eternally battling it. And then it transformed into what I recognized as Gabriel Iglesias' brother. I don't even think he has a brother. That was a really weird experience. Chapter 11 was another frustrating one, unfortunately. There's this part where you keep getting surprised by enemies, including some that have like assault rifles or whatever. And if you die, you have to restart that whole segment. They also introduce a new enemy type, a Ruvik clone, who can instantly kill you if they happen to notice you. Thankfully, I read an easy way to deal with them, but you could easily die a bunch and waste a lot of ammo if you don't know this trick. This was the enemy I mentioned earlier that you often can't sneak kill. It was this encounter that made me work on fully upgrading the crossbow to get those bolts that can set enemies on fire, because those will take the clones out in one hit. After this, you end up dealing with another battle where they just keep hitting you with waves of enemies, wielding everything from guns to dynamite to those assault rifle things. The last part was especially annoying because no amount of gunfire or grenades seemed to do anything to the last assault rifle guy. He just kept hiding behind this sliding door. I don't even remember how I finally got past him. It gets worse because then they put you up against some more guys with guns, and you have to ride this lift thing while enemies attack you. It was super stressful, and then I missed my first map fragment afterwards. I knew where it was, and I was like right past that part, and I could have got it, but Sebastian would not climb up this super low ledge, and it was infuriating. And then I got blown up several times by a vending machine. I saved Kidman, and then she just went and ditched me. I knew she was a traitor going into the game, and this did not improve my opinion of her. And then, oh, hi Leslie, and there he goes again. I really want him to make it through this. Sneaking through the mannequin plant or whatever was awful, and I kept worrying I'd accidentally use a match. I'll admit I used a guide for this part too, because I just wanted to get through the area. Still took me forever to find that freaking keycard and turn the gas off. And finally reunited with Joseph after this. Chapter 12 starts with a boss battle I do not have the ammo for, and Joseph's bad luck streak continues as he manages to get himself hurt. I get blown up several times trying to reach an ambulance, then several more times trying to return to the bus. Game goes all Grand Theft Auto for a bit, and then Ruvik makes us crash. I'm honestly not sure why he hasn't just killed us already. I guess he enjoys toying with people, but he's being oddly reckless here. We spend some time with Joseph in Chapter 13, but he just will not stick close to us, and of course we get separated because something breaks when he gets near it. And then there's the Keeper again. Fantastic. This is where the Ruvik clones reappear, and I realize sneak killing them doesn't work, but I thankfully have fully upgraded my crossbow for just this kind of situation. I'm starting to see safes on the floor, and that is not good. I accidentally trigger the Keeper and get killed by him, but that's apparently avoidable, so I don't let it happen the next time. Ruvik traps me in Hell's Kitchen, and I die more times by evil, murderous blade Roombas. And then I get thrown into another boss battle with the Keeper. Glad I was again checking the guide due to my ammo shortage, because you are apparently supposed to beat him twice, then go for the dumbwaiter. How you were supposed to know that is beyond me. We get outside, and Leslie is with Kidman and being his usual precious self, and then she tries to kill him. We stop her, thankfully, but Joseph ends up getting shot instead and just vanishes for the rest of the game, and we pretty readily accept him as just dead. Chapter 14 throws a lot of different stuff at us and ends up pretty frustrating, though not as bad as some earlier chapters. There's a bathroom full of explosive bolts. I manage to disarm one, but then get blown up the next time I try and do this. Another Ruvik clone I failed to recognize kills me after that, forcing me to redo that whole part. The next part is another area where I died a lot. There are a lot of deadly enemies, as well as a whole train car filled with more explosive bolts. I managed to sneak kill everyone to save ammo, but I have to snipe at least one guy to make it through. There's that subway bridge we resolved to use for some reason, and I'm sure nothing bad is going to happen while we're crossing it. After we get harassed some more by Ruvik, we end up in some kind of sewer area, and who doesn't love those? Too many of those two-headed enemies you can't sneak kill, but some weird tentacle keeps grabbing and killing them, which I am totally okay with. When that stops happening, I quickly learn to burn all that I see, using my fiery harpoon bolts for the others. End up finally overstocked on shotgun shells, forcing me to leave some behind. I'm pretty happy to have a chance to use some on a slightly annoying boss fight with that tentacle monster from earlier, only for the shells I left to have vanished when I returned for them. That sucks. Well, we have finally reached the last chapter, and Leslie's back, but he's acting strange. We keep seeing and getting separated from him, too. I don't think I mentioned this before, but this prisoner guy kept monologuing at us occasionally in some chapters, and I'm not yet sure if this was supposed to be someone relevant. I'm writing this out before playing the DLC. Anyway, Sebastian finally makes a comment about all the awful, ridiculously long elevator rides he's been having lately, and having played Resident Evil Village, I definitely sympathize. There's another part where they lock you in a room and send waves of enemies after you, and this led to me dying a lot more. Too many exploding things, and I am still worried about conserving my ammo. Doesn't help when Chainsaw Guy shows up, having now upgraded himself to Rocket Launcher Guy. And of course they send him in before all the normal enemies are dead, so I have to avoid him and them. They try to throw 2 keepers my way, but I've been saving my magnum bullets, so it ends up being the easiest battle in the game. Then comes a stressful stealth section, followed by some plot. Ruvik just melted poor Leslie, and I'm not sure what that means for him, but now we're falling and we get saved by landing on a giant brain. Ruvik is now a huge monster hell-bent on killing us, because of course he is. We run from him a bunch and then summon ourselves a rocket launcher. Did you know that the guy behind the first Resident Evil apparently made this game? Failed to realize you could aim the rocket launcher, so I died again. After you beat this segment, they tried to make this epic thing where Ruvik attacks you one last time and you headshot him, but I had a hard time aiming and just died a bunch. We defeat him and return to the real world, but Leslie is missing. I'm still hoping he's alive. We leave Beacon and the cops finally show up, even though it is way too late for them to do anything. Some awesome music kicks in as we walk outside, and we see Leslie walking away into the distance, and it feels like Ruvik has probably stolen his body. And then the game ends. It's not the worst ending, but I found myself left with a lot of questions. How did we even end up getting pulled into that other world? Why? Why did Ruvik not kill us, or at least Kidman, especially when it became clear she was trying to kill Leslie, his ticket back to the real world? What was with all the ancient-looking imagery? If we were in the simulation from the beginning, then why are all those bodies in Beacon still there? How did Ruvik kill them? It also never touched upon the stuff about Myra and what whenever she found. I know the sequel delves into that particular point, but people who beat this game when it first came out would probably be frustrated. And then there's the DLC, which I ended up having to download because it apparently doesn't automatically download when you buy the season pass. As a side note, I mentioned this earlier, but I wrote down all my notes about the previous parts of this review, everything leading up to this, before playing the DLC, so you can get my honest thoughts on the game by itself. Anyway, we play as Kidman for 2 of the DLC, the first of which is called The Assignment. She works for this shadowy organization called Mobius, and despite her actions in the main story, she was apparently supposed to just capture Leslie. Also, the game literally has a save cat now, and this is apparently before we even leave reality. Or maybe it's not? I'm not really sure. They put this giant needle thing into her wrist, and it gave me shudders. Kidman ends up in the other world after this with no weapons. I don't mind the more stealthy approach the DLC has, because I can use my other broken controller. The joystick works on that one, but the R1 button doesn't. Spotlight Monster is freaky as heck, and it's apparently looking for Leslie. If that thing is a product of Ruvik's mind, I have a lot of questions. I found a snail in some vents. It made some concerning sounds when I shined my flashlight on it, and seriously, what is going on in Ruvik's head? Anyway, I keep entering rooms, clearly set up for some kind of stealth sequence, and the one with the servers or whatever, where no enemy is in sight, I could just tell meant trouble. The boss battle with the light lady was a pain, but even though I died a lot, still less frustrating than the main game. And of course we have another sewer level. Why do games always have those? They even wreck those annoying invisible enemies too, and I ended up resorting to a walkthrough a lot, not because of issues not knowing what to do, but because I didn't want to miss any collectibles. They are a lot more informative than those of the main game, and they help develop Kidman and Jimenez. The latter who surprisingly gets a lot of development from this. Still no development for Joseph, unfortunately, though we do get to see him as a really creepy enemy we have to fight, and of course he breaks yet another thing, this time my utterly useless gun. We also learned that the marketplace area Sebastian went through was actually from Kidman's past. Though I'm a bit disappointed they didn't really, do more with it. Like, I would have liked to, like, explore her house or whatever. Or, like, even in the main game, maybe have, like, more hints about her when we went there. This reminds me of, like, how I felt upon beating the main game, kind of wishing it had been a little bit more like Silent Hill. The DLC files confirm that this simulation is supposed to be influenced by the experiences of those hooked up to it, but we don't really see much of that while playing as Sebastian. It would have been cool if they had had places and events linked to the traumas we read about in his personal files. Oh, and anyway, there goes Leslie again. He's pretty fast when he wants to be. It's just me, or does his voice sound different? Anyway, the first chapter ends with the shocking plot twist that Mobius might just be using us, which Ruvik hinted at earlier. I mean, it was pretty obvious from the start, just from how they talked to Kidman, but she is apparently stunned by this. So, moving on to the Consequence DLC, we're picking up where we left off, still playing as Kidman. There's an annoying darkness segment, and I didn't end up properly using those chemical lights, so I got an achievement. Would it have killed Spotlight Lady to show up so I could at least see what I'm doing? I kept falling to my death trying to reach some red light. And of course she shows up when the lighting actually gets better, and I kept getting eaten waiting for an elevator, just like the last time. We witness Jimenez discovering what happened to Ruvik, and he's surprisingly not okay with it. Also, Kidman learned some stuff about Sebastian, and wow, could Myra's missing poster look any more terrifying? We also get to see Joseph's desk at the police station, leading to the stunning revelation that he is Asian. Seriously, his desk is ridiculous. You got like a picture of Mount Fuji, a big paper lantern. Anyway, Leslie keeps getting into trouble, but then he gets an awesome moment where he freaking shoots Ruvik to save us. We get to see that super wholesome playground scene with him again, and I really just want to keep him safe. Kidman's boss, who I guess is called the Administrator, keeps showing up and being creepy throughout both DLCs, where we control her, and despite not exactly being a character, is fairly well done. He's the final boss in both, but we only get to actually fight him in the final one. Afterwards, we wake up in the bathtub room, where we learn Myra, Sebastian's wife, is actually part of Mobius. It seems like Mobius gets their hands on Leslie, but since we see him walking off on his own in the main game, who knows? All in all, I really liked the two Kidman DLCs. I wish some of the collectibles had been easier to find, given how important all of them are, and that we'd gotten to learn a bit more about her. It would have been nice to explore her house a bit more, for example. They did hear what I wish they'd done in the main game. It was largely about facing Kidman's demons, which, given his own trauma, I feel was really missing from Sebastian's story. Last up is the Executioner DLC, which seems to take place after the main game. At Mobius's request, a father enters STEM to try and rescue his daughter by severing the connection between STEM and other people trapped inside. Most of them are in the form of various boss monsters, while we take the form of the Keeper. It's not a terrible experience or even a bad one, but there's not a lot to it. Upgrades return here, and you can unlock various weapons, but I mostly just stuck to the default one and increased my damage, health, defense, stuff like that. It's not very long, and the story feels incomplete. I doubt we'll ever learn the ultimate fate of the protagonist and his daughter. There are some morbidly cute drawings before each boss, and one of those bosses is Joseph. His day just keeps getting worse. I hope a later game eventually tells us what happens to all those poor people Mobius is using in their experiments. The DLC overall does kind of fill in some of the holes from the main story. There are a lot of things I still don't understand. I'm still not sure how Ruvik killed those people at Beacon, for example. But yeah, that is my review of The Evil Within and its DLC. Like I said, I hope we get a third game, because I know the second one still doesn't address some things. A remake of this game could be interesting too, because I feel like they could fix some issues and make Sebastian's journey a more personal one. This video ended up way longer than I intended, I think. How long have I been recording? Nearly 30 minutes. I guess it's not too bad for a review. I hope you guys find this interesting. Please feel free to share your thoughts about the review and the game in the comments. I'd love to talk about either of them. I'm eager to get into Evil Within 2, so expect a review on that in the future. Bye!